The End of Oz, Chapter 5. Dorothy. I awoke in the caverns underneath the Emerald Palace. It was all a dream, I thought. I'm dead. I'm underground, and I'm dead. I blinked sleep away, my vision clearing. Being dead felt pretty much the same as being alive. Actually, being dead felt a lot better than being alive had felt ever since the god-awful bitch, Amy, showed up in Oz. In fact, it was downright comfortable. Because I was lying in a bed, I realized. A big bed. The kind of bed I'd always liked best. Satin sheets. Black with red trim. Very goth. A little tacky, but obviously expensive. A rich velvet coverlet. More black. High enough of the ground to need a little stool to get in and out. Black also. Filature studded with rubies. Was I in hell? Was that the reason for the black sheets? Aunt Em and Uncle Henry had always told me if I'd end up there, if I didn't say my prayers, or feed the chickens on time, or milk Bessie, or follow any of the 10,000 other orders they gave me every single day. But they turned out to be wrong about a lot of things. They weren't even my parents. I'd never even known my parents. It's really a wonder I turned out so well. I sat up in the giant bed and looked around. I was in a cave, true, but it was looking less and less like the caverns underneath the Emerald City and more like somebody's very weird idea of high luxury. It looked like something out of one of those creepy paintings that hung up in the church. Aunt Em used to take me back in Kansas. You know the kind I mean. Devils tormenting sinners with pitchforks, rivers of blood, lots of gore and dismemberment and serpents. Well, imagine if one of those painters began decorating homes, and you'd start to get an idea of the room I was in. No windows, of course. It was a cave, after all. Lots of velvet drapes and sinister artwork with people engaged in activities that looked either very unpleasant or very indecent. The rest of the furniture in the room matched the four-poster bed and the stool, all of it carved with the creepy elf-looking creatures that had to be the Gnome King's various ancestors. If my family was that ugly, I certainly wouldn't have commemorated it in stone, but to each their own. Everything was studded with more rubies, and I do mean everything. And then I looked up, and suddenly the Gnome King was looming over me. I made a very undignified noise of fright as everything that had just happened came rushing back to me all at once. Thankfully, it wasn't actually him, and no one was in the room to witness my embarrassment. It was a huge, somber oil portrait, larger than life-size. His pale eyes seemed to be staring right at me in a way that gave me the shivers, but otherwise it looked very handsome. He was wearing his iron crown and regal robes of black velvet. One hand rested on a staff topped with a massive ruby. Serpents, tongue of fire trailing from their fanged mouths, coiled at his feet, looking up at him with what I can only describe as loving expressions. So I wasn't dead. Score one for Dorothy the Witch Slayer. Survived Armageddon. With help. But still, I was obviously in the Gnome King's guest bedroom. At least I can only hope I wasn't in his actual bedroom. Some fresh air would have been nice, but the whole windowless underground lair situation suggested I'd have to pass on the particular luxury. And I had to admit, although the Gnome King's style was not entirely to my taste, the place was beautiful. Crystals spiked downward from the ceiling, a black fountain burbled black water in one corner, and now I noticed that a huge black wardrobe was tantalizingly half open, revealing a delectable selection of, you guessed it, black and red dresses. At least I wouldn't have to worry about whether I matched. I looked down. Someone, I could only hope not the Gnome King himself, because that would be a little forward of him, had gently bathed the dust from my skin and dressed me in a scantily negligee made of black lace and silk. A matching robe lay across the end of the bed, and I threw it over my shoulders, feeling suddenly vulnerable. I wanted to wear something else, something of my own choosing, so I snapped my fingers to summon a nightgown with a little more coverage. Nothing happened. I must still be tired from my giant ordeal and the shock of losing my crown. I snapped my fingers again, and waited for the answering feeling of magic to flare up within me. Instead I got what felt like faint, magical heartburn. I tried again, and again. Each time the response was stronger, but it was nowhere near strong enough. Was it possible Ev was interfering with my magic? That I was going to have to outwit the Gnome King without my power to help me? Okay, that was a problem. And it was a problem I was going to have to solve very, very soon. I threw off the covers, staring down at my glittering red heels. Was it something to do with the shoes themselves? That dimwit Amy Gum had tried to imply that the shoes might be bad for me, but that couldn't possibly be the case. The shoes were what had brought me back to Oz. The shoes were a gift from Glinda, who, as it turned out, might not have been entirely had my best interest at heart. It's not as though I hadn't had my suspicions at times. After all, she was still a witch underneath all that pink and glitter. But I didn't care. I wanted the shoes working again the way they were supposed to. The way they wanted to keep drowning in the poppy fields over the first time you'd passed out there. The way you kept craving more and more power once you'd had your first taste of it. The way some things just got under your skin. Without them, I was nothing. Without them, I was just little Dorothy Gale, farm girl, eyes on the horizon and up to her ankles in cow shit. I never wanted to be that girl again, and I wasn't going to be. What was wrong with my magic? And did it have anything to do with the Gnome King? I needed some food and a manicure before I could do any serious thinking. At least for the time being, I seemed to be safe, even if I was no closer to figuring out what the Gnome King's plan was for me. I wondered briefly if the Gnome King had a handy Gilia jam type around. He didn't seem like the kind of fellow who'd be much use in that department. Oh, Gilia. Do you know, after everything she did to me, I sometimes almost miss her. Nobody could apply a top coat like Gilia. If only she hadn't betrayed me. If only I hadn't had to punish her. I sighed. It's so hard to get good help these days. So here I was, in the bowels of the Gnome King's underground lair. No magic, no way to get to Oz. Not even a throne. I was Dorothy Gale, Witch Slayer. I had an endless supply of gumption. I could survive this. But how? And then a soft rap sounded at my door. I brightened. Hopefully this was breakfast. I was starving. I sat up expectingly and called. Yes? This door swung open soundlessly to reveal the Gnome King. You're awake, he said in that smooth, sinister voice. It wasn't entirely his fault that everything he said came out of his mouth sounding like he was trying to summon a demon from the far reaches of hell. From behind him scuttled a stooped, wrinkled servant in a shapeless sack-like dress that hid everything about her except her earthworm-pale, nearly bald head. She looked like a munchkin. Sort of. The world's saddest, shabbiest munchkin, anyway. In Oz, the munchkins were always very chipper. Perhaps the munchkins of Ev were a different breed. She was holding a silver tray covered with an assortment of cups and plates and steaming dishes. She placed the tray on the bedside table and scooted back into the corner, where she kept her eyes on the intricate red carpet that covered the stone floor. The Gnome King beamed downward at me. You've slept well, I trust. I know it's a difficult journey. Great, I said briskly, eyeballing the food. I was starving, and I definitely wasn't going up against Ev's biggest evil on an empty stomach. Please, help yourself, he purred. I was hoping for a singing pastry or two, but Ev's typical fare was not quite up to Oz's standards. There was an inky black soup, a little loaf of bread that was distinctively on the dry side, and a big plate of what looked suspiciously like mushrooms. But I was determined to be on my best behavior until I figured out what was going on, like, for example, whether or not I was an honored guest or a well-treated prisoner. I nibbled daintily on the loaf of bread, trying not to tear into it the way I wanted to. I have left you a servant as is. I believe the custom among your kind. He pointed to the scrubby, bald little thing who still waited patiently in the corner, not looking at either of us. She is a munchkin, he added. I thought you might like a touch of home while you stayed with us. On the one hand, I was touched. On the other, well, if he wanted me to feel at home, that didn't suggest he had any intention of letting me go any time soon. I didn't want to be at home in Ev. I wanted to go back to Oz. He'd said he could help me, but so far, he hadn't done anything except give me breakfast and a few things to think about. That's not a munchkin, I said before I could stop myself. If I knew anything about munchkins, it was that they had round, dimpled faces, and I alternately wanted to pinch or slap depending on my mood. This creature's face was thin and gaunt. She certainly did not look like she was about to break into song, as munchkins were annoyingly known to do. I assure you she is. I obtained her myself many years ago from Munchkin country. The Gnome King glanced pointedly at the munchkin, who curtsied several times in a rather frantic manner. If he was kidnapping munchkins and rescuing me from crumbling palaces, he could go back and forth between Oz and Ev, which meant he was the key to my getting home, or perhaps, even better, the little munchkin was, if she knew how he'd done it. "What a lovely and thoughtful gift," I said. "Really, it's nothing. I shall be honored if you will join me this evening for a banquet." He smiled broadly, his silver eyes glittering dangerously. "I simply won't take no for an answer, and I have some information that might be of interest to you, dear Dorothy. I imagine you're having a bit of trouble with your magic shoes." "Nonsense," I said briskly. "My dear, I'm quite aware that you're lying." I didn't like the sound of it at all. It was almost unfriendly. Besides, how could he possibly tell? I quickly calculated my options. There was no point in lying. Maybe if I played along, I could figure out what he was really up to. I sighed. "Well, I suppose there might be a few tiny issues." "How did you know?" "Because I made them." His smile was almost oily. "You made them?" As far as I'd known, Glinda had made the shoes. Certainly she'd been the one to give them to me. How was it possible that he even knew about them? Where had they come from? "In a sense," he said with a sharp look, as though he'd just revealed something he hadn't meant to. He seemed to be considering whether to tell me more. "Their original material is from the kingdom of Ev," he said finally. This was something Glinda had never bothered to mention. If there is a mind full of what my shoes are made of, imagine what I could do with all that magic. How very, very interesting, I thought. How very interesting indeed. There was more to the Gnome King and Ev than met the eye.